The wind howled across the Nebraska plains like a banshee in the night, but Sarah Evans barely noticed as she pressed forward, her determination stronger than the storm threatening to break overhead. It was 1876, and the West was still wild enough to swallow a woman whole if she wasn't careful, but careful had never been a word that defined Sarah. Her worn leather boots crunched against the dry earth as she followed tracks that any less experienced tracker would have missed. 3 days she'd been hunting this trail, and exhaustion pulled at her every limb. Her auburn hair whipped against her face as she squinted at the horizon, where a plume of smoke curled up against the fading light. Someone had made camp, and she prayed it was the man she sought. Drought had ravaged these lands for months now, leaving the prairie grasses brittle and gold. Sarah's canteen sloshed half empty at her hip as she moved with purpose toward the smoke. The scent of cooking meat reached her nostrils, making her stomach growl in protest of its emptiness. She'd been too focused on the chase to hunt properly. As she drew closer, she slowed her pace, hand resting on the rifle slung across her back. 6 years as a tracker for the Pinkerton Agency had taught her caution above all else. The camp came into view: a small fire, a canvas tent, and 2 horses tethered nearby. A covered wagon sat several yards away, its white canvas dulled by trail dust. Sarah crouched low behind a rock outcropping, surveying the scene. A tall man stood by the fire, his back to her, broad-shouldered and lean-hipped in the way of men who worked hard for a living. Beside the fire were 2 small bedrolls, and in them she could just make out the forms of children. Her heartbeat quickened. This had to be him, Daniel Jennings, the man who had disappeared from St. Louis 3 weeks prior with his young children after the tragic death of his wife. His brother-in-law had hired the Pinkertons to find them, claiming Daniel had stolen the children away in grief-stricken madness. Sarah watched as the man moved to kneel between the sleeping children. His voice carried on the wind, soft and breaking with emotion. "Thank you, Elizabeth," he whispered, his hand gently brushing the hair from one child's forehead. "Thank you for finding us a safe place wherever you are now." Something twisted in Sarah's chest. This wasn't the raving madman the brother-in-law had described. This was a grieving father, whispering gratitude to his dead wife for guiding them to safety. She must have shifted her weight, causing a small cascade of pebbles. The man whirled around, a revolver appearing in his hand with startling speed. "Who's there?" His voice was deep, steady, despite the obvious tension in his shoulders. "Show yourself." Sarah slowly stood, hands raised to shoulder height. "Mr. Jennings, my name is Sarah Evans." He narrowed his eyes, the gun still trained on her. In the firelight, she could see his features clearly now: a strong jaw shadowed with stubble, eyes as blue as a summer sky, and lines of exhaustion and grief etched into a face that couldn't be older than 30. "How do you know my name?" he demanded. "Your brother-in-law hired me to find you," she answered truthfully. "I'm a tracker with the Pinkerton Agency." A flash of something dark crossed his features. "Harold sent you to take my children." "He claims you stole them away in madness," Sarah said cautiously, still not lowering her hands. "But I'm starting to think there's more to this story." Daniel's gaze flicked to his sleeping children, then back to her. The boy couldn't have been more than 5, the girl perhaps 3. Both slept peacefully, oblivious to the tension crackling in the air around them. "My wife didn't just die, Miss Evans," he said, voice low with controlled rage. "She was poisoned slowly by her own brother." Sarah's eyebrows rose. This was not what she had been told. "Harold wanted her inheritance," Daniel continued, the gun still steady in his hand. "When Elizabeth began to suspect, she made me promise to take the children away if anything happened to her. I didn't want to believe it at first, but then I found her journal." "You have proof?" Sarah asked. "In my saddlebag, her handwriting detailing her symptoms, her suspicions." His jaw clenched. She was right. The day after her funeral, I overheard Harold telling his wife they'd be coming for my children next. Their inheritance passes to them, you see. "And Harold is their guardian if something happens to me." Sarah slowly lowered her hands. "May I see this journal?" For a long moment, Daniel stared at her, sizing her up. Then, with obvious reluctance, he lowered his gun. "You came alone." "I work best alone," she replied. He nodded toward his saddlebag. "It's there, but make any sudden moves toward my children, and I'll put a bullet in you before you take another step." Sarah believed him. There was a steadiness to him that spoke of a man who meant exactly what he said. She moved slowly toward the saddlebag, aware of his eyes tracking her every move. The leather journal she pulled out was worn, the pages filled with elegant feminine handwriting. She read by firelight, the words of a dying woman who knew she was being murdered, who feared for her children's lives after she was gone. The pain and desperation leaped off the pages. "She was lucid until the end," Daniel said softly. The doctors called it a wasting disease, but Elizabeth knew better. She recognized the pattern. The symptoms would worsen after every meal Harold insisted on sharing with us. Sarah closed the journal, her decision made. "Mr. Jennings, I was hired to find you, not to bring you or your children back." Hope and wariness battled in his expression. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that I need to report that I couldn't find your trail, that it went cold at the Missouri River." She handed the journal back to him. "And then I need to take this journal to the authorities in St. Louis." Daniel stared at her in disbelief. "Why would you help us? You don't know me." Sarah thought of her own past, of her sister who had died under suspicious circumstances while married to a wealthy banker. No one had listened to Sarah's concerns then. No one had helped. "Because I know what it's like when no one believes you," she said simply. "And because those children deserve to be safe." A small sound from one of the bedrolls drew their attention. The little girl was stirring, her eyes blinking open sleepily. "Daddy," her voice was small and drowsy. "Who's the lady?" Daniel moved to his daughter's side, holstering his weapon. "This is Miss Evans, Clara. She's a friend who's going to help us." The child regarded Sarah with solemn brown eyes so like her father's. "Are you an angel like Mama? Daddy says Mama's an angel now who watches over us." Sarah felt her throat tighten. "No, sweetheart, I'm just a person who wants to help your daddy keep you safe." Clara seemed to consider this, then nodded as if it made perfect sense. "Good, Daddy needs help. He sat a lot." Daniel's cheeks colored slightly. "Clara, that's enough now. Back to sleep." The child obediently lay down, and Daniel tucked the blanket around her shoulders. When he looked up at Sarah again, there was vulnerability beneath his stoicism. "We need to get further west," he said quietly. "Somewhere Harold can't reach us." "Wyoming territory," Sarah suggested. "I have connections there, people who could help you start over." "Why would you go to such lengths for strangers?" he asked, genuine puzzlement in his tone. Sarah looked at the sleeping children, then back to Daniel's face. "Because it's the right thing to do, and because 6 years of tracking people has taught me to recognize the guilty from the innocent." She hesitated, then added, "I also know what it's like to lose someone to murder and have no one believe you." Understanding dawned in his eyes. "Your kin, my sister," she replied, the admission costing her. 5 years ago." A moment of shared grief passed between them, a silent recognition of pain that bound strangers together more surely than any formal introduction. "We leave at first light," Sarah decided. "I'll help you reach Wyoming safely, then return to St. Louis with this evidence." Daniel nodded, relief evident in the slight relaxation of his shoulders. "Thank you, Miss Evans." "Sarah," she corrected him. "Sarah," he repeated, the name sounding different in his deep voice. "I'm Daniel." They stood across the fire from each other, two strangers connected by circumstance and shared purpose, neither yet realizing that this night would mark the beginning of a journey that would change both their lives forever. Dawn broke pink and gold over the eastern horizon as Sarah saddled her horse. She'd spent the night on the opposite side of the campfire from Daniel and his children, but sleep had been elusive. The weight of her decision pressed upon her, betraying her employer, aiding a man she'd just met based on a gut feeling and a dead woman's journal. It wasn't like her to be so impulsive. Daniel emerged from the tent with his son in his arms, the boy still heavy with sleep. Clara followed, clutching a rag doll that had seen better days. "James, Clara, this is Miss Sarah," Daniel said as he set his son on his feet. "She's going to travel with us for a while." James regarded her solemnly with eyes identical to his sister's. "Can you shoot Indians?" he asked James. Daniel admonished. Sarah crouched to the boy's level. I can shoot well enough to hunt food for us, but I've never shot at a person, Indian or otherwise, and I don't plan to start." The boy seemed disappointed by this answer. "Pa says there are wild Indians out west." "There are people of all kinds everywhere," Sarah replied carefully. "Some good, some bad. Judge by actions, not by what others tell you." Daniel gave her a grateful look over his son's head. "Let's get moving. We've got a lot of ground to cover." Within the hour, they were heading west, Daniel driving the wagon with his children beside him while Sarah rode alongside on her dappled mare. The morning was pleasantly cool, but Sarah knew the heat would soon become oppressive. The open prairie offered little shelter from the sun. "How long were you tracking us?" Daniel asked after they'd been traveling for a time. "3 days," Sarah replied. "You did a good job covering your tracks, but not good enough." A hint of a smile touched his lips, the first she'd seen. "I'm a rancher, not an outlaw." "Covering tracks isn't my specialty." "What is your specialty then?" she asked. "Horses," he replied, a flash of pride crossing his face. "Bred and trained them outside St. Louis, had a good business until—" His expression darkened. "Until Elizabeth got sick," Sarah finished for him. He nodded, his hands tightening on the reins. "Had to sell the ranch to pay for doctors who couldn't help her, or wouldn't. You think they were in Harold's pocket?" "I don't know." Daniel sighed heavily. "Elizabeth was well loved in town." It's hard to believe people would turn a blind eye, but money speaks louder than morals for some. They fell into silence as the sun climbed higher. The children dozed in the wagon, lulled by the steady motion. Sarah studied Daniel's profile surreptitiously, the strong line of his jaw, the furrow between his brows that seemed permanent. Grief had carved itself into his features, yet there was an underlying strength that impressed her. Around midday, they stopped beside a small creek to water the horses and eat a simple meal of jerky and hardtack. Clara insisted on sitting beside Sarah, peppering her with questions about her work as a tracker. "You catch bad men?" the girl asked, eyes wide. Sarah smiled. "Sometimes. Mostly I find people who are lost or who don't want to be found. Like us," Clara said with startling perception. "Yes," Sarah acknowledged. "Like you. Are we in trouble?" James piped up from where he was tossing pebbles into the creek. Sarah met Daniel's gaze over the children's heads. "No," she said firmly. "You're not in trouble. Your father is taking good care of you." Daniel's expression softened with gratitude. After lunch, as they prepared to continue their journey, he approached Sarah while the children were distracted with gathering wildflowers. "Thank you for that," he said quietly. "They ask questions I don't always know how to answer." "Children are perceptive," Sarah replied. "They know something's wrong even if they don't understand what." Daniel ran a hand through his dark hair, streaked with premature silver at the temples. "I don't know if I'm doing right by them, uprooting them, taking them away from everything they've ever known." "You're keeping them alive," Sarah said bluntly. "That's doing right by them." Before he could respond, Clara came running up with a fistful of prairie flowers. "For you, Miss Sarah," she announced, thrusting them toward her. Sarah accepted them with more tenderness than she usually allowed herself to show. "Thank you, Clara, they're beautiful." The child beamed, then scampered off to find her brother. Sarah carefully tucked the flowers into her saddlebag, aware of Daniel watching her. "She likes you," he observed. "Children usually do," Sarah replied with a small smile. "It's adults who find me difficult." Daniel's lips quirked upward. "I don't find you difficult. Surprising, yes. But not difficult." Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them, a moment of connection that startled Sarah with its intensity. She turned away first, busying herself with checking her saddle. "We should keep moving," she said briskly. "I want to reach the Platte River crossing before dark." They made good time that afternoon, the terrain gradually changing as they moved westward. The flat prairie gave way to rolling hills, and the vegetation grew sparser. Sarah kept a watchful eye on their surroundings, alert for any sign of pursuit or danger. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the land, Sarah spotted the silver ribbon of the Platte River ahead. "There," she pointed. "We'll camp on the far side tonight." Daniel nodded, urging the horses forward with a gentle flick of the reins. "Is it safe to cross now?" The water's low this time of year, Sarah replied. We should be able to ford it easily enough. The crossing went smoothly, the water barely reaching the wagon's axles. On the far bank, they found a sheltered spot surrounded by cottonwoods to make camp. While Daniel set up the tent and started a fire, Sarah took James to help her hunt for their supper. The boy proved to be a quiet, attentive companion as they stalked through the brush. When Sarah spotted a pair of rabbits, she signaled James to be still, then raised her rifle with practiced ease. "Watch," she whispered and squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out and one rabbit fell. The boy's eyes widened with admiration as Sarah handed him the rifle to hold while she retrieved their dinner. "You're as good a shot as Pa," he said as they walked back to camp. "High praise," Sarah replied with a smile. "Has your Pa taught you to shoot yet?" James shook his head. "Ma didn't like guns, said I was too young." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "There's wisdom in that. A gun is a big responsibility." "But I need to protect Clara," the boy said with sudden fierceness that reminded her powerfully of Daniel, "if the bad men come again." Sarah stopped, crouching to meet his eyes. "What bad men, James?" The boy looked down. "The ones who came to our house after Ma died. Pa thought I was asleep, but I heard them. They said Pa had to give us to Uncle Harold or there'd be trouble." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. "Did you tell your Pa you heard this?" James shook his head. "He was crying that night. I didn't want to make him sadder." Sarah placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You're very brave, James. And you're right to want to protect your sister. But right now, the best way to do that is to let your Pa and me handle things, okay?" The boy considered this, then nodded solemnly. "Okay, but when I'm bigger, when you're bigger, your Pa will teach you what you need to know," Sarah promised. "Now let's get this rabbit back to camp before everyone starts worrying about us." When they returned, Clara was helping Daniel gather firewood, her small arms loaded with twigs. The domestic scene struck Sarah unexpectedly, father and daughter working together, the tent set up, smoke curling from the nascent fire. It looked like a family, something Sarah had long ago decided wasn't for her. "Successful hunt," Daniel observed as they approached. Sarah held up the rabbit. "Your son is a natural tracker, quiet as a shadow." Pride bloomed on Daniel's face as he ruffled James's hair. "Just like his grandfather, my Pa could track a mouse across stone." "Pa, Miss Sarah says you'll teach me to shoot when I'm bigger," James announced. Daniel glanced at Sarah, one eyebrow raised. "Did she now?" He was concerned about protecting his sister, Sarah explained quietly. "I thought it best to redirect that energy." Understanding dawned in Daniel's eyes. "Good thinking." As darkness fell, they sat around the fire eating rabbit stew. The night was clear, stars scattered across the velvet sky in breathtaking profusion. Clara fell asleep in her father's lap while James fought to keep his eyes open. "Time for bed, son," Daniel said gently, rising with Clara in his arms. As he disappeared into the tent with the children, Sarah stared into the fire, thinking about the journey ahead. Wyoming was still many days away, and the chance of encountering trouble was high. Harold wouldn't give up easily, not with an inheritance at stake. Daniel returned, settling across the fire from her. "They're exhausted," he said. "All this travel is hard on them." "Children are resilient," Sarah replied, "more than we give them credit for." "Like you were?" Daniel asked perceptively. Sarah looked up, surprised by the insight. "Yes," she admitted. "After my parents died, I had to be—" "How old were you?" 12. "My sister Mary raised me after that." Sarah rarely spoke of her past, but something about the night and the man across from her loosened her tongue. "She was 18, gave up everything to keep me out of an orphanage." "She sounds like she was a remarkable woman," Daniel said softly. "She was." Sarah poked at the fire with a stick. "She married when I was 16, Walter Blackburn, a banker in Chicago, wealthy, respected. 2 years later, she was dead." Daniel waited silently, giving her space to continue or stop as she chose. "The doctor called it heart failure," Sarah went on, bitterness seeping into her voice. "But Mary had never been sick a day in her life. I tried to get someone to investigate Walter, but he was too well connected. No one would listen to a grieving sister with no proof." "What did you do?" Daniel asked. Sarah's smile was grim. I became a tracker, learned to find people who don't want to be found. And I've been looking for evidence against Walter ever since. Have you found any? She shook her head. Nothing concrete, but I've found other wives who died mysteriously. He's on his fourth now. Daniel let out a long breath. That's why you believed me, why you're helping us. Partly, Sarah acknowledged, but mostly because I believe in justice and what Harold's doing isn't just. They sat in companionable silence for a while, the fire crackling between them. Finally, Daniel spoke again. James told you about the men who came to our house, didn't he? Sarah nodded. He overheard them threatening you. Daniel's jaw tightened. Harold's hired guns. I recognized one of them. He'd done work for Harold before. Unsavory business. He looked directly at Sarah. They'll be coming after us. Harold won't stop until he has the children. I know, Sarah replied. That's why we need to be careful, leave no trail they can follow. And if they find us anyway, Sarah's hand moved to the revolver at her hip. Then we'll deal with that when it happens. Daniel studied her face in the firelight. You're not what I expected when I saw you standing there last night. What did you expect? Someone harder, colder? His eyes held hers. You have a good heart, Sarah Evans. The compliment unsettled her more than it should have. Don't mistake practicality for goodness, Mr. Jennings. Daniel, he corrected. And I rarely mistake things about people. It's how I've stayed alive this long. Sarah looked away first, uncomfortable with the warmth spreading through her chest. We should get some rest. Dawn comes early. Daniel nodded, rising to his feet. I'll take first watch. You sleep. Wake me in 4 hours, Sarah instructed, moving to her bedroll positioned beneath a cottonwood. As she drifted toward sleep, she was aware of Daniel's silhouette against the starry sky, his rifle across his knees as he kept vigil over his sleeping children and now over her as well. It was a strange feeling being watched over. Strange, but not unwelcome. The next morning dawned with a sky heavy with clouds, promising rain before the day was out. Sarah awoke to the smell of coffee and bacon, finding Daniel already up and cooking breakfast. The children were still asleep in the tent. You didn't wake me for my watch, she accused mildly, accepting the cup of coffee he offered. You needed the rest, he replied simply, and I couldn't sleep anyway. Sarah studied his face, noting the dark circles beneath his eyes. You can't keep going without sleep, Daniel. You'll make mistakes. I'll sleep when my children are safe, he said, turning the bacon in the pan. They need you healthy and alert, not exhausted, Sarah countered. Tonight, you'll sleep when I take watch. That's non-negotiable. Daniel looked like he might argue, but instead he just nodded. You're probably right. I usually am, Sarah said with a hint of a smile. The children emerged from the tent, rubbing sleep from their eyes. Breakfast was a quiet affair, everyone sensing the need to make haste. The clouds were darkening, and Sarah was anxious to cover as much ground as possible before the rain hit. They'd been traveling for about 2 hours when Sarah, riding ahead, spotted something that made her blood run cold. She quickly turned her horse back toward the wagon. Daniel, she called softly but urgently, stop the wagon. He pulled the horses to a halt, instantly alert. What is it? Riders ahead, she replied, keeping her voice low. 4 of them coming this way. Daniel's hand moved to his rifle. Harold's men. Can't be sure, but we can't take chances. There's a ravine about half a mile back. We can hide the wagon there until they pass. Daniel nodded, turning the wagon around carefully. They made their way to the ravine Sarah had mentioned, a deep cut in the earth that would conceal them from view. As Daniel guided the wagon down the slope, Sarah dismounted. Stay here, she instructed. I'll go back and see who they are. Be careful, Daniel said, his eyes intense with concern. Sarah nodded, then moved stealthily back toward the trail. She found a vantage point behind a cluster of rocks where she could observe without being seen. The riders were closer now, and as they came into clear view, her suspicions were confirmed. One of the men she recognized from Daniel's description, a hired gun known for his ruthlessness. She watched them approach, then halt at the spot where they'd turned off the trail. One man dismounted, studying the ground carefully. They turned off here, he called to the others. Recent tracks. Sarah cursed under her breath. She should have been more careful about covering their trail. The men spread out, searching for signs of which direction they'd gone. Moving silently, Sarah made her way back to the ravine. Daniel's face was grim as she approached. "Harold's men?" he asked, though he clearly already knew the answer. Sarah nodded. "They've found our trail. We need to move now. The wagon will leave tracks wherever we go," Daniel pointed out. Sarah thought quickly. "The storm's coming. We need to reach the river before it hits. If we cross and the rain washes out our tracks, they might lose us." Daniel glanced at his children, who were watching with wide, frightened eyes. "It's our best chance," he agreed. They moved out of the ravine, taking a route that would eventually lead back to the river. Sarah rode ahead, watching for any sign of their pursuers. The sky continued to darken, and a distant rumble of thunder warned of the approaching storm. They pushed hard, the children bouncing silently in the wagon as Daniel urged the horses to a faster pace. Sarah's mind raced, calculating distances and options. If they could reach the river crossing before the men caught up, they might have a chance. The first fat raindrops began to fall as the river came into view. Sarah felt a surge of hope they might make it after all, but as they approached the riverbank, her hope turned to dismay. The gentle ford they had crossed yesterday was now a churning, swollen mass of water. "Flash flood upstream," she called to Daniel as he pulled the wagon to a halt beside her. "The crossing's too dangerous now." Daniel surveyed the raging water, then glanced behind them. "We can't go back." Sarah nodded grimly. "We'll have to find another way across," she pointed downstream. "There might be a narrower section we could manage." They followed the riverbank for nearly a mile before finding a spot where the river narrowed between two rocky outcroppings. The current was still swift, but the water seemed slightly less turbulent. "This is our best chance," Sarah decided, eyeing the darkening sky. "The rain's only going to make it worse." Daniel studied the crossing, his expression tense. "The wagon might make it, but it'll be close." "I'll go first," Sarah said, guiding her horse toward the water. "If I can get across, the wagon should be able to." Before Daniel could protest, she urged her mare into the churning water. The horse balked at first, then plunged forward. The current was powerful, pushing them downstream as they fought across. Sarah kept her seat with practiced skill, guiding the mare with subtle pressure from her knees. Water surged around her waist, then receded as they reached the midpoint. For a moment, she thought they would make it easily, then her mare lost her footing on the slippery riverbed. Sarah felt the horse lurch beneath her, heard Daniel's shout from the bank, and then they were both fighting against the current. Sarah clung to her saddle as her horse struggled to regain her footing. The roar of the water filled her ears, and for a terrifying moment she thought they would be swept away. Then her mare found purchase on a submerged rock, lunged forward, and scrambled up the far bank. Soaked and breathless, Sarah turned to signal to Daniel that the crossing was possible but dangerous. The look of naked fear on his face startled her. Had he been that concerned for her safety? "Take it slow," she called across the water. "Stay right of the center where I lost footing." Daniel nodded, gathering the reins. "Clara, James, hold on tight," he instructed his children. "Don't let go of the wagon, no matter what." The children clung to the sides as Daniel guided the wagon into the water. The horses fought against the current, the wagon creaking ominously as water surged around the wheels. Sarah held her breath, watching their slow progress. They were nearly 3/4 across when disaster struck. A large branch, carried downstream by the flood, slammed into the lead horse. The animal reared in panic, throwing the wagon off course. The current caught it broadside, and for a heart-stopping moment, Sarah thought it would overturn. Without hesitation, she plunged her mare back into the water, fighting her way toward the struggling wagon. Daniel was desperately trying to control the frightened horses while keeping the wagon upright. Clara was screaming, her tiny hands white-knuckled on the wagon's side. Sarah reached them just as the wagon lurched over a submerged rock. The impact knocked James loose from his handhold, and the boy tumbled toward the water. "James!" Daniel's shout was raw with terror. Sarah reacted instinctively, leaning far out of her saddle to snatch the boy's collar as he fell. The weight nearly pulled her from her horse, but she managed to haul him up across her saddle. "I've got him," she shouted to Daniel. "Get Clara across." With renewed determination, Daniel fought the horses forward. Inch by excruciating inch, the wagon moved toward the far bank. Sarah, with James clinging to her waist, stayed alongside, ready to help if the wagon faltered again. When they finally reached the shore, Daniel leapt from the wagon and lifted Clara down, holding her tightly as she sobbed against his chest. Then he turned to Sarah, who was helping a shaken James dismount. Without a word, Daniel pulled both Sarah and his son into his embrace, holding them fiercely. "Thank you," he whispered hoarsely against her wet hair. "Thank God you were there." Sarah found herself returning the embrace, her arms around both Daniel and his son. For a moment they stood together as the rain poured down, united by the shared brush with tragedy. The thunder crashed overhead, breaking the moment. "We need shelter," Sarah said, reluctantly pulling away. "The storm's only getting worse." Daniel nodded, releasing her but keeping a hand on James's shoulder as if afraid to let go. "There are bluffs ahead. We might find a cave or overhang." They moved away from the river, the wagon wheels struggling in the mud as the rain came down in sheets. Sarah led the way, searching for any natural shelter that might protect them from the storm. After nearly an hour of miserable travel, she spotted what they needed: a rocky outcropping with a deep natural alcove beneath it, large enough for all of them and possibly even the wagon. "There." She pointed through the curtain of rain. They made their way to the shelter, Daniel backing the wagon as close as possible to keep their supplies dry. The alcove was deeper than it had appeared, forming a shallow cave that provided blessed relief from the downpour. Clara was shivering violently, her lips tinged with blue. Sarah immediately began stripping the child's wet clothes. "We need to get them dry and warm," she told Daniel, who was already doing the same for James. "There are blankets in the chest," Daniel said, nodding toward the wagon. "Should still be dry." Sarah retrieved the blankets while Daniel started a small fire near the mouth of the alcove, using dry wood from inside the wagon. Soon both children were wrapped in blankets, huddled near the fire. Their own clothes were soaked through, but Sarah ignored her discomfort, focusing on warming the children. "You need to change too," Daniel said quietly, noticing her shivering. "You'll catch your death." "I'm fine," Sarah insisted. Daniel gave her a stern look. "I have spare clothes in the wagon." "They'll be too big, but they're dry. Please, Sarah." Something in his tone made argument impossible. Sarah nodded, taking the offered clothes and moving to the back of the cave for privacy. As she changed, she could hear Daniel speaking softly to the children, reassuring them that they were safe. When she emerged in Daniel's oversized shirt and pants, rolled up at the cuffs, he had changed as well and was setting out some food. The children were already looking better, color returning to their cheeks as they warmed by the fire. "That was scary," Clara announced as Sarah joined them. "But Miss Sarah saved James, like an angel." Sarah smiled at the child. "Not an angel, just someone who can swim well." "You saved my boy," Daniel said quietly, his eyes meeting hers over the fire. "I can never repay that debt." "There's no debt," Sarah replied firmly. "I did what anyone would do." "No," Daniel shook his head. "Not anyone. You risked your life for my son." His voice grew husky. "For my family." The word hung between them, laden with meaning neither was ready to acknowledge. Sarah looked away first, suddenly uncomfortable with the intensity in Daniel's gaze. "We should eat something, then get some rest," she said practically. "The storm might last all night." They ate a simple meal, the children dozing off before they had finished. Daniel carried them to the back of the alcove, making a bed for them with blankets. When he returned to the fire, his face was thoughtful. "I've been thinking," he said quietly so as not to wake the children. "Those men will keep searching for us." "Yes," Sarah agreed, "but the rain will wash away our tracks. It might buy us some time." Daniel nodded, but not enough. "Not if they're determined." He looked up at her, his expression grave. "I think we need to split up." Sarah frowned. "That's too dangerous." "More dangerous than being caught together?" Daniel challenged. "If we separate, you could take James and Clara ahead while I lead the men away. Then I could circle back and meet you." "Absolutely not," Sarah said firmly. "I won't let you sacrifice yourself as a decoy." "They're my children," Daniel insisted. "I'd do anything to keep them safe." "Which is exactly why you need to stay with them," Sarah countered. "If something happened to you, what then?" "Harold would have exactly what he wants: your children with no one to protect them." Daniel was silent for a long moment, staring into the fire. You're right, he finally acknowledged, but we need a plan. We can't just keep running and hoping for the best. Sarah considered their options. We need to reach Wyoming as quickly as possible. Once there, I have friends who can help protect you while we gather enough evidence to bring Harold to justice. Can your friends stand against hired guns? Daniel asked skeptically. My friends include a federal marshal and a judge, Sarah replied with a small smile, so yes, I think they can. Hope flickered across Daniel's tired face. How far to Wyoming? 3 days hard ride, maybe 4 with the wagon, Sarah calculated, but first we need to lose our pursuers. They discussed strategies late into the night, the storm raging outside their shelter. Eventually, they settled on a plan. They would leave false trails, split up temporarily during the day and reunite at night, using Sarah's tracking skills to find each other while making it nearly impossible for others to follow them. As the fire burned down to embers, Daniel insisted Sarah get some rest while he took first watch. Too exhausted to argue, she stretched out near the children, her eyes already heavy with sleep. Just before consciousness slipped away, she felt something warm being tucked around her shoulders, Daniel's coat. She opened her eyes slightly to see him sitting nearby, his profile illuminated by the dying fire as he kept vigilant watch over his children and over her. In that moment, something shifted in Sarah's heart, a door opening that she had kept firmly shut for years. The realization that she was coming to care for this man and his children was both exhilarating and terrifying. She closed her eyes again, pushing the thought away. This wasn't about her feelings. It was about justice and keeping innocent children safe. But as sleep claimed her, Sarah couldn't deny that somewhere along this dangerous journey, Daniel Jennings and his children had begun to matter to her in ways that went far beyond professional duty. The storm had passed by morning, leaving behind a world washed clean and sparkling in the early sunlight. Sarah woke to find Daniel asleep beside his children, his face for once relaxed in slumber. She moved quietly, not wanting to disturb them as she checked their supplies and the condition of the horses. The wagon had weathered the storm well enough, though one wheel showed signs of damage from the river crossing. Sarah examined it critically, deciding it would hold for now but would need repair at the first opportunity. When she returned to the cave, Daniel was awake, watching her with a half-smile. Always working, he observed quietly, careful not to wake the children. Sarah shrugged. Someone has to. Thank you, he said simply, for everything. Save your thanks for when we reach Wyoming safely, Sarah replied, uncomfortable with his gratitude. Daniel rose, stretching his tall frame. The wheel's damaged, isn't it? I noticed it listing yesterday. Sarah nodded, impressed by his observation. It'll hold for now, but we should find a settlement where it can be repaired. There's a trading post about a day's ride from here, Daniel said. I passed it on my way east a few years back. Good. Sarah busied herself with packing up their supplies. We should reach it by nightfall if we leave soon. The children woke shortly after and they breakfasted on jerky and hardtack. As they prepared to depart, Sarah laid out the plan for the day. I'll ride ahead and make sure the route is clear, she explained. You follow with the wagon, but take this alternate path I've marked on the map. It's longer but less likely to be watched. Daniel studied the map, committing the route to memory. Where will we meet? Here. Sarah pointed to a spot on the map. There's a creek that runs through a stand of cottonwoods. I'll find you there by nightfall. Clara tugged at Sarah's sleeve. Why can't you stay with us? Sarah crouched to the girl's level. Because I need to make sure the way is safe for you and your brother. Like a scout. The explanation seemed to satisfy the child, though she still looked unhappy. James, standing beside his father, maintained the solemn expression that seemed to be his natural state. Be careful, the boy said to Sarah, his young face serious. The bad men might get you. I'm very good at not being caught, Sarah assured him with a confidence she didn't entirely feel. I'll see you tonight. With a last look at Daniel, who watched her with worried eyes, Sarah mounted her mare and rode out. The day was clear, the air fresh after the storm. She made good time along the main trail, keeping a sharp eye out for any sign of Harold's men. By midday, she had covered considerable ground with no sign of pursuit. Perhaps the storm had delayed them more than expected. Still, Sarah remained vigilant, checking and double-checking her surroundings before moving on. She reached the trading post late in the afternoon, a ramshackle collection of buildings surrounding a central store. A few horses were hitched outside, and smoke rose from the chimney. Sarah approached cautiously, surveying the scene before riding in. The trading post appeared peaceful enough, with a few travelers gathered on the porch. Sarah dismounted, tying her horse to the hitching rail, and entered the store. The interior was dim after the bright sunlight, filled with the scent of tobacco, coffee, and leather. A grizzled man behind the counter looked up as she entered. "Help you, miss. Need supplies," Sarah replied casually. "Ammunition, coffee, and information." The man's bushy eyebrows rose at the last item. "Information costs extra." Sarah placed a silver dollar on the counter. "I'm looking for a wheelwright. Got a damaged wagon wheel that needs repair." The storekeeper relaxed, pocketing the coin. "Old Silas can fix most anything with wheels." "Live's just behind the post, but he don't work cheap." "Price isn't an issue if the work's good," Sarah replied. She gathered the supplies she needed, paying with cash and avoiding unnecessary conversation. As she turned to leave, the storekeeper called after her. "You might want to be careful on the trails. Some rough types came through earlier, asking after a man and two young'uns." Sarah froze, then slowly turned back. "Oh, what sort of types?" "Gun hands," the man replied with a shrug. "Didn't like the look of them myself. Told them I hadn't seen hide nor hair of any man with children. They headed west about 2 hours ago." "Much obliged for the warning," Sarah said, her mind racing. If Harold's men were already west of them, they might encounter Daniel and the children on the trail. She hurried out, mounting her horse and galloping away from the trading post. She needed to find Daniel and warn him before it was too late. The rendezvous point was still several hours away, and Daniel wouldn't be expecting her until evening. Sarah pushed her mare hard, taking shortcuts through rough country to intercept the path Daniel would be following. The sun was low in the sky by the time she spotted the wagon in the distance, moving slowly along a tree-lined creek. Relief flooded through her, but it was short-lived. As she drew closer, she noticed something that made her blood run cold: fresh hoofprints on the trail ahead, heading toward the wagon. 4 riders moving at a walk, as if stalking prey. Sarah spurred her horse forward, cutting across country to reach Daniel before the gunmen did. She crested a small rise just in time to see the 4 riders emerging from the trees ahead of the wagon. Daniel saw them too. He pulled the wagon to a halt, pushing the children down out of sight. Sarah could see him reaching for his rifle as the riders approached. Without hesitation, Sarah drew her own rifle and fired a warning shot into the air. The unexpected sound startled both the gunmen and Daniel, all heads turning in her direction. Using the distraction, Sarah charged down the hill, firing again, this time aiming closer to the gunmen. The riders scattered, seeking cover. Sarah reached the wagon, pulling up alongside. "Get the children into the trees," she ordered Daniel. "I'll hold them off." Daniel hesitated only for a split second before nodding. He grabbed James and Clara, lifting them from the wagon and running for the cover of the dense cottonwood grove nearby. Sarah dismounted, using the wagon as cover as she fired again at the gunmen, who had regrouped and were returning fire. Bullets thudded into the wooden wagon body as she ducked down. The shooting continued for several tense minutes, neither side gaining an advantage. Sarah knew they were in a precarious position, outnumbered and with limited ammunition. She needed to find a way to get to Daniel and the children so they could escape. A movement to her right caught her attention. Daniel had circled back through the trees and was now at the edge of the grove, his rifle ready. He caught her eye and signaled his intention. Sarah nodded, understanding his plan. She fired several rapid shots, forcing the gunmen to keep their heads down. In that moment, Daniel broke cover, running toward her in a low crouch. He reached the wagon just as Sarah's rifle clicked empty. "The children?" she asked breathlessly. "Hidden in a hollow log," Daniel replied, pressing additional ammunition into her hands. "But we need to move. They'll flank us soon." As if to confirm his words, one of the gunmen appeared at the side of the wagon. Daniel reacted instantly, tackling the man before he could fire. They grappled in the dust, the gunman's weapon discharging harmlessly into the air. Sarah reloaded quickly, then fired at another approaching gunman, forcing him back. She turned to help Daniel, but he had already subdued his opponent, the man lying motionless on the ground. "Is he?" Sarah began. "Just unconscious," Daniel replied, retrieving the man's gun. "But the others will be more careful now." A bullet whizzed past Sarah's ear, embedding itself in the wagon behind her. The remaining gunmen had indeed grown more cautious, firing from well-concealed positions. "We need to get to the children and escape," Sarah said urgently. Daniel nodded. "On my signal, run for the trees, I'll cover you." Before Sarah could protest this plan, Daniel rose slightly and fired 3 rapid shots. "Now," he shouted. Sarah hesitated for only a fraction of a second before sprinting toward the tree line. Gunfire erupted behind her, and she heard Daniel returning fire. She reached the trees safely, turning back to see Daniel dashing after her, bullets kicking up dust at his heels. He joined her in the shelter of the trees, breathing hard. "This way," he whispered, leading her deeper into the grove. They found the children huddled inside a hollow log, as Daniel had said, their small faces pale with fear. Clara let out a cry of relief when she saw them, quickly stifled by James's hand over her mouth. "Quiet, remember?" the boy whispered. Daniel gathered them both close. "You did perfectly," he assured them. "Now we need to move very quietly through the trees. Can you do that?" Both children nodded solemnly. Sarah was struck by their courage, these small people who had already endured so much. "The horses?" she asked Daniel softly. "Lost," he replied grimly. "We'll have to proceed on foot until we can find new mounts." Sarah's heart sank. On foot with 2 young children, they would be easy prey for the gunmen. They needed another plan. "The trading post is about 5 miles east," she said. "If we can reach it by morning, there's a wheelwright there who might help us." Daniel considered this. 5 miles is a long way for little legs," he said, glancing at his children. "We'll carry them if we have to," Sarah replied determinedly. "We can't stay here." They began moving eastward through the woods, staying parallel to the creek for guidance. The children were remarkably quiet, seeming to understand the gravity of their situation. When Clara began to tire, Sarah lifted her onto her back without hesitation. The child's arms wound trustingly around her neck, her small breath warm against Sarah's ear. They traveled through the night, stopping only for brief rests. The moon provided enough light to navigate by, though they stayed within the trees whenever possible for cover. By dawn, they had covered nearly 4 miles, and the trading post was within reach. But their progress had not gone unnoticed. As they paused at the edge of a clearing, Sarah spotted movement on the trail behind them. "They're still following," she warned Daniel, "and they're gaining." Daniel looked at his exhausted children, then at Sarah. "Take James and Clara ahead to the trading post," he said, his decision made. "I'll lead them away." "Daniel, no, it's the only way," he interrupted. "I can move faster alone, create a false trail. Meet me north of the trading post in 2 days." Sarah wanted to argue, but the sound of approaching horses made the decision for her. 2 days, she agreed reluctantly. "Don't be late." Daniel knelt before his children. "You'll go with Miss Sarah now," he told them. "Be brave and do exactly as she says. I'll come for you soon." Clara began to cry silently, clinging to her father. James stood straight, trying to be brave though his lip trembled. "Promise you'll come back?" the boy asked. "I promise," Daniel replied, hugging them both fiercely. "Nothing could keep me away." He stood, meeting Sarah's eyes over the children's heads. For a moment, something passed between them, something deeper than words. Then Daniel leaned forward and pressed a brief, hard kiss to her lips. "Keep them safe," he whispered against her mouth, and then he was gone, moving swiftly through the trees in the opposite direction. Sarah stood frozen for a moment, her lips tingling from the unexpected kiss. Then she gathered herself, taking each child by the hand. "Come," she said gently. "We need to reach the trading post before those men realize your father's trick." They moved as quickly as the children could manage, Sarah carrying Clara when the girl's steps faltered. James kept pace gamely, his small face set with determination so like his father's that it made Sarah's heart ache. The trading post came into view as the sun rose fully above the horizon. Sarah approached cautiously, alert for any sign of the gunmen. The place seemed peaceful, with only a few early risers visible. She led the children to the back of the post where the wheelwright's workshop stood. The door was open, an elderly man already at work inside. "Mr. Silas," Sarah called softly. The old man looked up, his rheumy eyes taking in the woman and two exhausted children. "That's me," he confirmed. "What can I do for you, madam?" "We need help," Sarah said simply. "Men are after these children, and we've lost our wagon and horses." Silas studied them for a long moment, then nodded toward an inner door. "Get inside the house. My Martha will see to the little ones while we talk." Relief washed over Sarah as she ushered the children into the modest home behind the workshop. Martha proved to be a kindly woman who immediately set about feeding the hungry children while Sarah explained their situation to Silas. The old man listened without interruption, then nodded thoughtfully. "Heard about men asking after a fella with young uns," he acknowledged. "Didn't like the look of them myself. Their uncle wants to harm them for their inheritance," Sarah explained. "Their father is leading the men away to give us a chance to escape." Silas scratched his grizzled chin. "Reckon I might be able to help. Got a small wagon I use for deliveries." "Not much to look at, but it'll get you where you're going." "We can pay," Sarah assured him, reaching for her money. Silas waved her off. "No need. I know trouble when I see it, and those little ones deserve better than to be hunted like rabbits." Tears pricked at Sarah's eyes at the unexpected kindness. "Thank you," she said simply. They spent the day at the wheelwright's home, the children catching up on much-needed sleep while Sarah kept watch. By evening, Silas had prepared the small wagon and procured a sturdy horse to pull it. "North, you said?" he asked as Sarah prepared to depart. She nodded. "We're to meet their father north of here in 2 days." Silas pointed to a crude map he'd drawn. "Take this trail, leads to an old trapper's cabin about 15 miles north. Good place to wait, out of sight." Sarah memorized the map, then tucked it away. "I can't thank you enough. Just keep those young uns safe," Silas replied gruffly, "and when you get where you're going, let me know you made it." He pressed a scrap of paper with an address into her hand. "My son's in Laramie, send word there." As they prepared to leave, Martha appeared with a bundle of food and supplies. "For the journey," she said, pressing it into Sarah's hands, "and something for the little girl." She handed Clara a small rag doll, simply made but lovingly crafted. Clara's face lit up as she clutched the doll. "Thank you, madam." Sarah helped the children into the wagon, then took the reins. With a last grateful nod to the old couple, she guided the horse onto the trail heading north. They traveled through the night, Sarah pushing the horse as much as she dared. The children slept in the wagon bed, wrapped in blankets Martha had provided. By dawn, they had covered nearly 12 miles. The trapper's cabin appeared just as Silas had described, a small, sturdy structure nestled against a hillside, nearly hidden by surrounding pines. Sarah approached cautiously, rifle ready, but the place was deserted. Inside, they found a single room with a stone fireplace, rough-hewn furniture, and a pallet for sleeping. It was dusty but sound, the roof intact and the chimney clear. "We'll wait here for your father," Sarah told the children as she built a small fire to ward off the morning chill. "How will Pa find us?" James asked, helping her arrange kindling. "He's a good tracker like me," Sarah replied with more confidence than she felt. "He'll find us." They settled into a tense vigil, Sarah taking turns at the small window to watch the approach to the cabin. The children were subdued, sensing her anxiety despite her attempts to appear calm. By the second day, Sarah's worry had deepened to dread. There had been no sign of Daniel, nor of the gunmen. The agreed meeting time came and went. Still, Sarah maintained her post at the window, watching and waiting. As dusk fell on the third day, Clara approached Sarah where she stood at the window. "Is Pa lost?" the child asked quietly. Sarah crouched to look Clara in the eye. "Your father is very smart and very brave," she said carefully. "If he's delayed, it's because he's making sure it's safe before he comes to us." Clara considered this. "He kissed you," she observed, "before he left." Sarah felt her cheeks warm. "Yes, he did. Does that mean you're going to be our new mama?" The question was asked with such innocent hope that it stole Sarah's breath. Sarah began, then stopped at the sound of approaching hoofbeats. She immediately moved the children to the back of the cabin, positioning herself by the door with her rifle ready. The hoofbeats slowed, then stopped outside the cabin. Sarah's heart pounded as she listened for any clue to the rider's identity. Sarah. The familiar voice calling her name made her knees weak with relief. She threw open the door to find Daniel dismounting from an unfamiliar horse, his face bruised but his eyes alight with relief at the sight of her. "Pa!" The children rushed past Sarah to throw themselves into their father's arms. Daniel knelt to embrace them, his eyes closing briefly as he held them close. Over their heads, his gaze met Sarah's, and the intensity in those blue depths made her heart skip. "You're late," she said, trying for sternness but failing as a smile broke through. "Had to take the scenic route," he replied, rising with Clara in his arms and James clinging to his leg. "Those fellows were quite persistent." "Did you lose them?" Sarah asked anxiously. Daniel nodded. "Eventually, led them all the way to the Nebraska border before doubling back." He gestured to his mount. "Borrowed this horse from a sympathetic farmer." "You're hurt," Sarah observed, noticing the dried blood on his temple. "Just a graze," Daniel dismissed it. "I've had worse shaving." Despite his light tone, Sarah could see the exhaustion etched in his face. She ushered him inside the cabin, where she insisted on examining his wound, while the children told him excitedly about Silas and Martha and their new wagon. The graze proved to be a bullet wound that had narrowly missed doing serious damage. Sarah cleaned it carefully, acutely aware of Daniel's eyes on her face as she worked. "I was afraid you wouldn't be here," he admitted quietly while the children were occupied with preparing a meal from their supplies. "I said I would be," Sarah replied simply. Daniel caught her hand, stilling its movement. "Thank you for keeping them safe." "They're good children," Sarah said, suddenly shy under his intense gaze. "Brave, like their father." His thumb traced circles on the back of her hand. "Clara's been asking if you're going to be her new mother." Sarah's breath caught. "She asked me the same question just before you arrived." "And what did you tell her?" Daniel's voice was low, his eyes never leaving hers. "I didn't have a chance to answer," Sarah replied honestly. "You interrupted." A smile tugged at the corner of Daniel's mouth. "Convenient timing." "Perhaps," Sarah agreed, withdrawing her hand to continue tending his wound. "Though I'm not sure what I would have said." "What would you like to say?" Daniel pressed gently. Sarah focused on applying a clean bandage, buying time to steady her racing heart. "I'd say that's a conversation for adults to have first." Daniel's smile widened. "Fair enough." He caught her hand again as she finished with the bandage. "When we reach Wyoming, when the children are safe, will you have that conversation with me, Sarah Evans?" The tenderness in his voice, the hope in his eyes, it was almost too much. Sarah had spent years building walls around her heart, focused solely on justice and her work. Yet here was this man, this family, somehow finding their way through those defenses as if they'd never existed. "Yes," she whispered, the word feeling momentous as it left her lips. "I will." The smile that broke across Daniel's face was like sunrise after the longest night. Before he could respond further, Clara called them to dinner, the moment suspended between them like a promise waiting to be fulfilled. That night, as the children slept, Daniel and Sarah sat by the dying fire, planning their final journey to Wyoming. The border was still 2 days' ride away, and Daniel was certain Harold's men would regroup and continue the pursuit. "We'll leave before dawn," Sarah decided. "Take the least traveled routes. With luck, we can cross into Wyoming territory before they pick up our trail again." Daniel nodded, adding another small log to the fire. "And then, my friend Judge Wilson has a ranch near Laramie," Sarah explained. "He can offer protection while we gather evidence against Harold." "Will it be enough?" Daniel asked, his voice tight with worry. "Harold has money connections. Judge Wilson has more," Sarah assured him, "and he despises men who abuse their position to harm others." She hesitated, then added, "He helped me when I was trying to build a case against my sister's husband." Daniel studied her face in the firelight. "You never told me what happened with that," Sarah sighed, poking at the embers. "Nothing happened. I had suspicions but no proof." Walter was too careful. She looked up at Daniel. But Harold won't be as lucky. We have Elizabeth's journal, and with the judge's help, we can find witnesses, build a case. And then, Daniel asked again, his question encompassing more than just their legal strategy. Sarah met his gaze steadily. And then you and your children will be free to build a new life, without looking over your shoulders. With you. The question was soft but direct. Sarah's heart thundered in her chest. If that's what you want. It is, Daniel said without hesitation. The children already adore you. And I. He trailed off, seeming to search for words. You, Sarah prompted, barely breathing. Daniel moved closer, his hand finding hers in the firelight. I've never met anyone like you, Sarah Evans. Brave, stubborn, brilliant. His fingers intertwined with hers. When Elizabeth was dying, she made me promise to find happiness again someday. I didn't think it was possible. And now, Sarah whispered, now I think she sent you to us, Daniel said simply. Like an angel, as Clara says. Sarah shook her head. I'm no angel, just a woman doing what's right. Maybe that's the same thing. Daniel's free hand came up to cup her cheek. I'm falling in love with you, Sarah. I think I started the moment I saw you standing there in the firelight, refusing to be intimidated by my gun. The words sent a rush of warmth through Sarah's body. How long had it been since anyone had said such things to her? Had anyone ever? She began, but words failed her. Instead, she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, then deepening as Daniel's arms came around her, pulling her closer. Sarah melted against him, all her doubts and fears momentarily forgotten in the rightness of his embrace. When they finally broke apart, both were breathless. Daniel rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed as if savoring the moment. I think, Sarah said softly, finding her voice at last, that I might be falling in love with you too, Daniel Jennings. His eyes opened, bright with joy even in the dim light. Might be, Sarah smiled, her heart lighter than it had been in years. I'm a cautious woman. I like to be certain of things. Then I'll just have to convince you, Daniel replied, his smile matching hers. Every day until you're absolutely certain. They stayed by the fire late into the night, talking in low voices about their plans, their hopes, their shared future. And when Sarah finally retired to her pallet beside the sleeping children, she felt as though something long broken inside her was finally beginning to heal. They left the cabin before dawn as planned, loading their few possessions into the small wagon. The children were sleepy but cooperative, understanding the need for quiet and speed. Daniel drove while Sarah rode ahead on his borrowed horse, scouting the trail for any signs of danger. The day passed without incident, the landscape gradually changing as they moved northwest. By evening, they had covered nearly 30 miles, pushing the horses to their limits. They made camp in a sheltered draw, keeping the fire small and their voices low. The next morning brought a new challenge, a wide river swollen with spring runoff. The nearest bridge was miles downstream in a settlement where they risked being spotted. We'll have to ford it, Daniel decided after surveying the rushing water. Sarah nodded grimly. There's a spot upstream that looks shallower, but it will be dangerous with the wagon. They approached the ford cautiously, Daniel testing the depth with a long branch before attempting to cross. The water was high but passable, the current strong but not overwhelming. I'll go first with the wagon, Daniel said. If we make it across, you follow with the horse. Sarah shook her head. No, I'll lead the way with the horse. If the footing is good, signal you to follow. Before Daniel could protest, Sarah had mounted and urged the horse into the water. The animal balked initially, then moved forward, picking its way carefully across the rocky riverbed. The water rose to the horse's chest at the deepest point, but Sarah kept him moving steadily. When she reached the far bank, she turned and waved to Daniel. He gathered the reins, spoke soothingly to his horse, and guided the wagon into the rushing water. The crossing went smoothly at first, the wagon creaking but holding steady as the horse pulled it through the current. Then, halfway across, one wheel hit a submerged boulder, jolting the wagon violently. Clara screamed as she was nearly thrown from her seat. Sarah watched in horror as the wagon tilted precariously. Without hesitation, she plunged back into the river, fighting her way toward them. Daniel had managed to steady the wagon, but the damaged wheel was now visibly wobbling. "Take Clara." He shouted over the roar of the water, lifting the terrified child toward Sarah as she reached them. Sarah pulled Clara onto her horse, then reached for James. With both children safely on her mount, she guided it toward the shore while Daniel fought to bring the faltering wagon across. The wheel gave way just as they reached the shallows. The wagon lurched sideways and Daniel was thrown into the water. Sarah watched anxiously as he surfaced, sputtering but unharmed, and waded the rest of the way to shore. "The supplies," he gasped, looking back at the half-submerged wagon. "Leave them," Sarah insisted. "We need to keep moving." Daniel looked like he might argue, but one glance at his shivering children changed his mind. He mounted behind Sarah and they continued on, all four of them crowded onto the single horse. By nightfall, they had reached the foothills that marked the border of Wyoming territory. Despite their slow pace and the loss of the wagon, spirits were high. They were almost to safety. They made camp in a small clearing, sheltered by towering pines. With most of their supplies lost in the river, dinner was meager. The last of their jerky and a handful of wild berries Sarah had gathered along the trail. "Tomorrow we'll reach Judge Wilson's ranch," Sarah promised as they huddled around the small fire. "Hot food and real beds for everyone." "And no more running?" Clara asked hopefully. Daniel pulled his daughter close. "No more running, little one." The night was clear, stars scattered like diamond dust across the velvet sky. After the children had fallen asleep, Daniel joined Sarah where she sat keeping watch. "One more day," he said quietly, settling beside her. Sarah nodded, her eyes scanning the darkness beyond their campfire. "Judge Wilson will know what to do next. He has connections in Washington, can arrange federal protection if necessary." "And then?" Daniel asked, echoing his question from the cabin. Sarah turned to look at him, her expression softening. "And then we have that conversation we promised." Daniel's hand found hers, his touch warm in the cool night air. "I already know what I want to say." "So do I," Sarah admitted, surprising herself with her certainty. "But let's get the children to safety first." They sat in companionable silence, hands linked, watching the flames dance. For the first time in years, Sarah allowed herself to imagine a future that included more than justice and vengeance, a future with this man and his children, a family of her own. The attack came just before dawn. Sarah had dozed off despite her intention to keep watch, lulled by the warmth of Daniel beside her and the false sense of security their proximity to Wyoming provided. She woke with a start at the sound of a twig snapping nearby. Instantly alert, she reached for her rifle, her movement waking Daniel. Before either could react, shadowy figures emerged from the trees surrounding their camp. "Well, well," a familiar voice drawled. "Quite the domestic scene." Sarah recognized the leader of Harold's gunmen, a tall man with cold eyes and a scar bisecting his left cheek. He held a revolver trained on Daniel, while his three companions covered Sarah and the sleeping children. "Jennings, you've led us a merry chase," the man continued. "Mr. Sutton is most eager to see his niece and nephew." Daniel rose slowly, positioning himself between the gunmen and his children. "Harold has no right to them," he said, his voice steady despite the danger. "Rights come to those with money and power," the gunman replied with a shrug. "And Mr. Sutton has both." His gaze shifted to Sarah. "You, however, were an unexpected complication. Pinkerton, aren't you?" Sarah didn't answer, her mind racing for a way out of this trap. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and the children were vulnerable. "No matter," the man continued when she remained silent. "Mr. Sutton's instructions were clear. Bring back the children, deal with any obstacles." The threat hung in the air, unmistakable. Sarah's fingers tightened on her rifle, knowing any sudden move would likely get them all killed. "The children stay with me," Daniel said, his voice hard as steel. "I'm their father." "Not for much longer," the gunman replied coldly, raising his revolver. "Nothing personal, Jennings, just business." Time seemed to slow as Sarah watched the gunman's finger tighten on the trigger. In that suspended moment, she made her decision. With a cry that was part rage, part desperation, she raised her rifle and fired. The The gunman staggered backward, his shot going wide as Sarah's bullet found its mark. Chaos erupted around them. Daniel lunged for the nearest attacker, wrestling him to the ground. The children woke screaming as gunfire split the dawn. Sarah fired again, dropping a second gunman. The third aimed at her, but his shot went wild as Daniel's opponent crashed into him. The two men fell in a tangle of limbs, giving Daniel the opportunity to grab a fallen revolver. The lead gunman, wounded but still dangerous, was struggling to his feet, his weapon raised toward Daniel's unprotected back. Sarah threw herself forward, tackling the man as his gun discharged. Pain exploded in her side, but adrenaline kept her moving, fighting to keep the gunman's weapon pointed away from Daniel and the children. They grappled in the dirt, Sarah's smaller frame belying her strength and determination. The gunman's face twisted with rage as she managed to knock his weapon away. He struck her hard across the face, sending her sprawling. "Sarah!" Daniel's shout cut through the ringing in her ears. She looked up to see the gunman reaching for his fallen revolver. Without hesitation, she drew the knife from her boot and lunged forward. The blade sank deep into the man's thigh, cutting through the femoral artery. His cry of pain turned to a gurgle as blood pumped from the wound, his face paling with shocking speed. In moments, it was over. 3 gunmen lay dead or dying, the fourth unconscious from Daniel's powerful blow to the head. The clearing was eerily quiet save for the children's muffled sobs and the harsh sound of Sarah's breathing. Daniel rushed to her side, his face ashen as he took in the spreading bloodstain on her shirt. "You're hit," he said, voice tight with fear. "It's not bad," Sarah lied, the pain building now that the immediate danger had passed. "See to the children." Daniel hesitated, clearly torn, then moved to gather his terrified children into his arms, murmuring reassurances. Sarah pressed her hand to her side, wincing at the wet warmth that seeped between her fingers. The bullet had caught her just below the ribs, the wound bleeding freely but not gushing, a good sign that it had missed major vessels. "We need to move," she said, forcing herself to focus past the pain. "There might be others." Daniel looked up from the children, his expression grim. "You need a doctor." "Judge Wilson's ranch," Sarah insisted. "It's not far now, we can make it by noon if we hurry." Daniel clearly wanted to argue, but the logic was sound. They were in the middle of nowhere with an injured woman, 2 traumatized children, and the possibility of more gunmen on their trail. Their best hope was to reach the safety of the ranch as quickly as possible. With Daniel's help, Sarah bound her wound as best she could. The children watched with wide, frightened eyes as she gritted her teeth against the pain. Clara approached hesitantly, offering her small handkerchief. "For your hurt," she said solemnly. Sarah managed a smile despite the pain. "Thank you, sweetheart." They left the clearing as dawn broke fully, Sarah insisting she could ride while Daniel walked alongside, leading the horse. James and Clara rode double behind Sarah, their small arms wrapped tightly around her waist, carefully avoiding her injured side. The journey was agonizing, each step of the horse sending jolts of pain through Sarah's wound. She focused on remaining conscious, on the feel of the children's arms around her, on Daniel's worried glances. She would not fail them now, not when they were so close to safety. By mid-morning, the landscape had become familiar to Sarah. They were nearing Judge Wilson's property. The pain in her side had become a constant, burning presence, and she was light-headed from blood loss. The bandage was soaked through, but she said nothing, pushing onward through sheer force of will. "There," she finally managed, pointing to a plume of smoke visible in the distance. "The ranch." Daniel's face showed naked relief. "Hold on, Sarah, just a little farther." She nodded, unable to waste energy on words. The world had narrowed to the path ahead and the need to stay upright in the saddle. She was vaguely aware of Daniel quickening their pace, of the children's frightened whispers behind her. The ranch house came into view, a substantial 2-story structure of weathered timber, surrounded by outbuildings and corrals. As they approached, men appeared from the stables, alerted by the unusual sight of 4 people on a single horse. "Help," Daniel called. "We need help." The last thing Sarah remembered was strong hands lifting her from the saddle as darkness finally claimed her. She woke to the unfamiliar sensation of softness beneath her and the scent of clean linen. For a moment, she lay still, cataloging her surroundings without opening her eyes, an old habit from years of dangerous work. The pain in her side had dulled to a persistent throb, and she could feel the tight binding of fresh bandages around her torso. Voices murmured nearby, pitched low as if to avoid disturbing her. One was Daniel's, the deep timbre unmistakable even in whisper. The other was older, authoritative Judge Wilson, she guessed. "She's lucky," the older voice was saying. The bullet passed clean through without hitting anything vital, another inch to the right. "Will she recover fully?" Daniel's question held barely suppressed anxiety. "With rest and proper care, yes." A pause. "She's a remarkable woman, your Miss Evans. Not many would have survived what she endured to bring you here." "I know," Daniel's voice softened. "I owe her everything." Sarah opened her eyes then, blinking in the gentle lamplight. She was in a spacious bedroom, simply but comfortably furnished. Daniel sat in a chair beside the bed, his face drawn with worry. Beside him stood Judge Wilson, tall and imposing even in his 70s, his silver hair and beard meticulously groomed. "Sarah," Daniel noticed her wakefulness immediately, leaning forward to take her hand. "Thank God, the children." Her voice was raspy from disuse. "Safe," Daniel assured her. "Being spoiled rotten by Mrs. Wilson as we speak." Relief flooded through her. "How long?" "2 days," Judge Wilson answered, moving closer to the bed. "You've been unconscious since you arrived, lost a great deal of blood." Sarah tried to sit up, wincing as the movement pulled at her wound. Daniel immediately moved to help her, arranging pillows behind her back for support. "Harold's men?" she asked. "Dead save one," Daniel replied grimly. "The sheriff has him in custody in Laramie. He's already confessed that Harold hired them to kill me and bring the children back. With that confession and Elizabeth's journal, we have enough to move against Harold Sutton," Judge Wilson added. "I've already wired the federal marshal in St. Louis. By now, Sutton should be in custody." Sarah closed her eyes briefly, overwhelmed by the realization that it was truly over. The danger had passed, the children were safe, justice would be served. "You did it, Sarah," Daniel said softly, squeezing her hand. "You saved us all." She shook her head weakly. "We saved each other." Judge Wilson cleared his throat. "I'll leave you two alone. Sarah needs rest, Mr. Jennings, but I suspect she needs peace of mind even more." His knowing gaze shifted between them. "Mrs. Wilson will bring up some broth shortly." When the door closed behind the judge, Daniel moved to sit on the edge of the bed, still holding Sarah's hand as if afraid to let go. "The children have been asking for you constantly," he said, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "Clara is convinced you're a real angel now, having defeated the bad men to protect them." Sarah smiled despite her exhaustion. "I'd like to see them when Mrs. Wilson thinks it's appropriate." "Tomorrow, perhaps," Daniel agreed, "if you continue to improve." His expression grew serious. "You nearly died, Sarah, when you collapsed in my arms." His voice broke. "I thought I'd lost you before I ever really had you." Sarah squeezed his hand. "I'm stronger than I look." "I know that," Daniel said fervently. "You're the strongest person I've ever known." He hesitated, then continued. "When you were unconscious, I had a lot of time to think. About Elizabeth, about what happened, about the future." "And," Sarah prompted gently when he paused. "And I realized that Elizabeth would want this, would want me to find happiness again, would want her children to have a mother who loves them." His blue eyes held her steadily. "I love you, Sarah Evans. I want you to be my wife, to help me raise James and Clara, to build a new life together." Sarah's heart swelled with emotions she had long denied herself: joy, hope, love. For years, she had kept the world at arm's length, focused only on justice and survival. Now, this man and his children had awakened something she thought had died with her sister, the ability to envision a future filled with more than just duty and vengeance. "Daniel," she began, her voice thick with emotion, "I've spent so long being alone, being strong." "You don't have to be alone anymore," he said simply. "And being strong doesn't mean being alone. It can mean having the courage to love again, to trust again." Sarah looked at him, this good, brave man who had endured so much yet still had room in his heart for love. At his children who had faced danger and loss yet remained resilient and open-hearted, they had become precious to her, more important than her own safety or comfort. "Yes," she whispered, the word feeling like freedom. "Yes, I will be your wife, Daniel Jennings." The smile that broke across his face was like sunrise after the darkest night. He leaned forward, cradling her face in his hands, and kissed her with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes. "I promise to make you happy," he murmured against her lips. "You and the children, you're my whole world now." "And you are mine," Sarah replied, her heart full to bursting with a joy she had never expected to feel. A soft knock at the door interrupted the moment. It opened to reveal Mrs. Wilson, a plump, motherly woman carrying a tray of steaming broth. Behind her peeked two small faces, James and Clara, unable to contain their eagerness to see Sarah. "Now, children," Mrs. Wilson admonished gently, "Miss Evans needs her rest, just a quick visit." But Sarah was already holding out her arms, uncaring of the pain the movement caused. "It's all right," she said, her eyes meeting Daniel's over the children's heads. "Family belongs together." The children rushed to her bedside, Clara climbing carefully onto the bed while James stood solemnly beside his father. Mrs. Wilson set down the tray and withdrew discreetly, a knowing smile on her kind face. "Are you going to get better?" Clara asked anxiously, her small hand patting Sarah's arm. "Of course she is," James answered before Sarah could. "She's the strongest lady ever." "And the prettiest," Clara added loyally. Daniel laughed, the sound rich and free in a way Sarah had never heard before. "She certainly is," he agreed, winking at Sarah. "And guess what? Miss Sarah has agreed to be your new mother." The children's reactions were instantaneous and joyful, Clara squealing with delight and throwing her arms around Sarah's neck, James breaking into a rare, beaming smile that transformed his solemn little face. "Really, truly?" Clara asked breathlessly. "Really, truly," Sarah confirmed, her throat tight with emotion. "If that's all right with you both." "I already decided," James announced with the certainty of a 5-year-old, "the day you saved me in the river. I told Clara you were going to be our ma." Sarah looked at Daniel over the children's heads, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. This was what she had been searching for all along, without even knowing it, not just justice, but love, a family of her own. As Daniel gathered all three of them into a careful embrace, Sarah knew with absolute certainty that she had found her home at last. 3 months later, on a perfect summer day, Sarah Evans became Sarah Jennings in a simple ceremony at Judge Wilson's ranch. Clara served as flower girl, scattering wildflower petals with enthusiastic abandon, while James stood proudly beside his father, the rings secured carefully in his pocket. The news had come from St. Louis the week before Harold Sutton had been convicted of his sister's murder and the attempted murder of her family. He would spend the rest of his life in prison, the children's inheritance safe under the management of a court-appointed trustee until they came of age. After the ceremony, as guests celebrated on the ranch's sweeping lawn, Daniel found his new wife standing apart, watching the children play with the other youngsters. "Happy, Mrs. Jennings?" he asked, slipping his arm around her waist. Sarah leaned into his embrace, savoring the rightness of it. "Happier than I ever thought possible," she admitted. They stood in comfortable silence, watching as Clara showed her new doll to a friend, while James engaged in a pretend sword fight with Judge Wilson's grandsons. "I bought land yesterday," Daniel said after a moment. 200 acres just east of Laramie." Sarah looked up at him in surprise. "You did," he nodded, a smile playing at his lips. "Good grazing land with a creek running through it and a clearing perfect for a house, room for horses, cattle, room to grow." "Our ranch," Sarah said wonderingly. After years of constant movement, of tracking and being tracked, the idea of putting down roots was both foreign and deeply appealing. "Our home," Daniel corrected gently. "If you approve, that is. I know you're used to more excitement than ranch life might offer." Sarah laughed, a sound that came more easily to her these days. "Daniel Jennings, I've had quite enough excitement to last a lifetime. A home, a family, peace, that's all the adventure I need now." His arms tightened around her. "I love you, Sarah Jennings." "And I love you," she replied, turning in his embrace to face him. You and those two remarkable children." As if summoned by her words, James and Clara came running over, faces flushed with excitement. "Ma, Pa." James called he had adopted the title for Sarah immediately after the engagement, as if making up for lost time. "Come see, there's a man with tricks," Daniel laughed, scooping up Clara while James tugged at Sarah's hand. "We'd better go investigate these tricks," he said with mock seriousness. Sarah allowed herself to be led across the lawn, her heart full as she watched Daniel swing Clara onto his shoulders, the child's delighted giggles floating on the summer air. This was her family now, these three people who had found their way into her heart when she least expected it. That night, after the celebration had ended and the children were tucked into bed in the Wilsons' guest room, Sarah stood by the window, watching the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. Daniel joined her, wrapping his arms around her from behind, his chin resting on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" he asked softly. Sarah leaned back against his solid warmth. "About how differently things might have turned out if I hadn't found your camp that night. But you did," Daniel said, turning her to face him. "You found us because you were meant to. Because Elizabeth was watching over us, guiding us to you." Sarah smiled, remembering the words she had overheard that first night, Daniel thanking his dead wife for finding them a safe place. At the time, she had thought he meant the campsite. Now she wondered if he had somehow sensed what was to come. "Thank you," Daniel whispered, echoing her thoughts, "for finding us." "Thank you for waiting to be found," Sarah replied, rising on tiptoe to kiss him. Outside the window, a shooting star streaked across the velvet sky, a blessing, Sarah thought, from a woman she had never met but whose love had guided them all to this moment. A blessing on a new beginning, a new family formed from loss and hardship, but bound together now by something stronger than any danger they had faced. Love had found them all in the end. And Sarah knew, as Daniel's arms tightened around her, that it would sustain them through whatever the future might bring.